Yo, I'm Dunmere. I'm a rank 1 peak Supervive player, and I have almost 1,000 hours played in this game. So with that, I put together a Brawl guide for you guys. Hope you enjoy.
Let's discuss Brawl's strengths and weaknesses, starting with the strengths. Brawl is an extremely powerful character with a kit stuffed full of capability. He excels at getting on top of enemies and, just like in the name, brawling them, bullying them with the numerous options he has, and defending himself all at the same time. So let's go a bit more in depth on this. Brawl's first core strength is his absolutely insane mobility. Brall has 2 full high range movement abilities on top of 3 spot dodges that also get reset all at once. This makes him the highest mobility character in all of Supervive, and lets him escape from or chase down any enemy he wants to, which in a BR oriented around escaping for or stopping beacon reses is extremely powerful. Yet not only is the mobility excellent, but it's also very flexible. On top of him simply having multiple ways to micro adjust his movement, he also has things like the tether, for example, that doesn't force him to commit with its use, but gives him the option to take it or not. The rapid pace, distance, flexibility, and maneuverability that his movement allows means he's rarely limited on what kind of situation he can engage into, making him all around the master of movement. Yet on top of this, he's capable of using this insane movement to facilitate his second core strength, which is his amazing close range brawl capability. Of course, it's a bit on the nose to be given the name Brawl and a resounding strength in brawling too, but that's what we have, as Brawl is decked out with numerous close range capabilities that all apply AoE value. All of his attacks can hit multiple enemies, he has tether spin that can anti-whole teams, and his stun can also hit multiple enemies, so he simply is amazing in a melee. Yet on top of this, his ultimate also can hit multiple enemies, but even protects him from all abilities and damage from every angle, which leads into his related third core strength of his amazing self-sustain. While other characters may be concerned to throw themselves into the middle of the enemy team, Brawl is simply not, because of this ability to protect himself from every direction during his ult. Even if he didn't have such a powerful self-defense tool, he'd also still have the high lifesteal his ultimate offers, and the passive buff of healing himself for 20% of the max HP for any enemy he knocks or mob he kills. Brawl's self-sustain is simply excellent for a non-healer character, so even if he takes too much damage outside of his complete self-protection ult, he can get much of it back if he plays correctly. Despite Brawl's great power level in these strengths, he still does have a defining weakness. This weakness is that his character design requires committing physically to engagements due to his close effective range. He does of course have a range projectile that he can throw out, but he won't be able to get near the kind of value you can get at close range. While this wouldn't normally seem like such a huge disadvantage with his amazing close range utility and stunning mobility, the nature of third partying in battle royale games inherently puts a character or team at risk when they have to commit, as there's often a third team prowling around to punish them directly after. So while Brawl may be incredibly powerful in terms of a one team versus one team fight, he also sometimes forces his team into taking unideal fights just because of his need to commit, and also often may put his team at a disadvantage in circles where his team really can't just go in safely at all. So with the strengths and weaknesses covered, let's talk about how to actually play Brawl. Brawl plays best full send, getting into enemy teams and causing as much havoc as possible. He wants to catch enemies by surprise and hit groups with as much AoE damage, stuns, and anti-heal as he can, before dashing out to reset, heal back up, and then just go do it all again. So with that as an overview of general strategy, let's get into specifics on his abilities. For Brawl's primary fire sword swing, there are a couple of nuances that are important to understand. The first of these is that Brawl gets max damage if he hits enemies at the tip of his blade. So when fighting enemies, you really want to micro position in a way that you won't be getting too close or too far from your target, but be able to keep them right at the sweet spot instead. Brawl's swings restore a bit of mana on hit also, which isn't something you should usually hard focus on, but using this can give you just enough mana to escape within certain situations when you otherwise wouldn't have been able to recharge it fast enough. For the ranged version of Brawl's sword swings, there is an important use tip also. This is because they grant a higher percentage of his empowerment bar compared to regular attacks. So if you have some downtime before a fight, you can poke at enemies to recharge it, or since empowerment charge can be farmed off of mobs, you can quickly charge your empower state with ranged attacks if mobs are nearby, to then get an advantage in the fight that comes after. As for Brawl's heavy attack, this is where a huge portion of his value will come from in a fight. So it's important to know that both Execution Slam and Air Slam have sweet spots. Execution's sweet spot is at the tip of the attack, while Air Slam's is at the middle. It's very important to focus on using these, as hitting your Execution Slam sweet spot will dramatically increase your damage output, and hitting the Air Slam sweet spot will turn a slow into a full stun. So you don't have to hit the sweet spot on Air Slam over the Abyss. In addition to all of this, it's important to know that Air Slam and Tether anti-heal spin are on separate cooldowns, while Charge Dash and Execution Slam share one. This means that Brawl is free to combo things like using Charge Dash as an engagement tool that he can then finish with an Air Slam. He won't have his Execution Slam right afterwards, so you do have to plan around this. But regardless, this allows for Brawl's best engagement strategy of using Charge Dash, as starting with his Charge Dash still allows for an Air Slam combo right after. Sure, you can't use Execution Slam right after using Charge Dash, but usually it's okay to wait a bit. Regardless, this combo is the best for many other reasons too, as it's much easier to aim compared to tether engages, doesn't require there to be an obstacle or person to tether to, and also doesn't have the predictable tell that throwing out your chain does to say you're probably going in. When using charge dash for an engage though, just make sure to jump before you release the charge dash to get even higher movement distance. And then you can even jump again right as you land to maintain momentum with a little bunny hop, which is great for getting just the right distance you need for a slam, or just go even farther. Moving on to tether chain, though it's usually best to engage with Brawl's R&B charge attack as I mentioned, this doesn't mean tether chain isn't useful. Rather, there are still situations where you'll want to engage with it, which are when the enemy has high healing supports on their team, and especially when teams like that group up. So feel free to change up your engagement combo in a situation like this, so you can heavy attack mid-tether pull to anti the enemy. But regardless, tether chain is usually more useful for other things, as this long cooldown means you don't want to be expending it compared to the short cooldown of the R&B charge dash, and it just has other useful things it can do. If you land a slam on enemies, you can guarantee a tether hit on them also. This will first anti them, but also give you a huge advantage in the following struggle. This is because Brall can 1, of course pull himself to the enemy with the tether, 2, also pull them to him with it, and 3, can choose when to do it, or just choose not to do it at all. This gives him a massive advantage in the fight for its 6-second duration, while still letting him play completely normally to bully them and thrash him with this damage. Assuming he's winning, he can then just suck them back when they try to escape, though it's best if you try to catch them as they're in the air, as it'll pull them farther back instead of sort of just rooting them. And even better if you can catch them like this right after they use their dash so they have no counterplay at all anymore. Alternatively, if Brall somehow finds himself losing, he can just back off with no problems, as he is not forced to use the tether and it will just cancel the end of his duration. Admittedly, Brall would have less total mobility with which to escape afterward if you do use a tether chain like this, so it is a bit riskier. But considering Brall still has his defensive ultimate, his R&B charge up that will nearly always be off cooldown by then, and his left shift dashes, he should be fine. Similarly, the tether is also useful as a sort of ruse, or secondary option because you don't have to take it. It allows you to pop it at enemies to apply indirect pressure, hit a flanking enemy or near one and they'll be pressured to back up, as they'll constantly be under the risk of you jumping on them. Then you can just play like normal and do whatever you want, and if the opportunity comes to jump on them, then you can just do that too. In terms of actual tether use technique though, it's important to know that the tether doesn't actually pull you directly to it, but instead pulls you towards your cursor first, and then swings you toward the general region of the tether in a smooth motion. So practice it a bit while paying attention to your cursor placement when using the tether, so you can get a good feel for where you'll go when you use it. For Brawl's left shift, it is just a simple set of 3 dashes, but has a unique quality that gives it a lot of value. This is that you can use these dashes at any point during your other abilities. Essentially, this makes it incredibly powerful for microing the exact position of your air slams, your execution slams, and even your ultimate, as it will let you move them in any direction while you're using them. Brall is an extremely complicated character, but learning to make good use of your left shifts during your other abilities should be one of your absolute highest priorities, simply because of the massive value it will net you. Finally, we have Brawl's ultimate. This ability is quite simple overall. It makes yourself immune to any damage or abilities, and then causes you to slash out to damage and lifesteal. But the exact use is where you get nuance. So in terms of use value, make sure to try and predict enemies' CC abilities and use the ult to block them. Brall usually won't just die to regular damage, so hold your ult for when big stuns are coming. In addition, you can guarantee resetting your ultimate by knocking an enemy with it. So if you've held onto your ultimate, get the opportunity, and are confident you can actually secure a knock, as in your teammates wouldn't even accidentally steal it, you're completely free to pop your ult to full defend yourself during your enemy's dying attacks, while just getting it right back after. Just make sure to position yourself well with your left shift dashes so you actually hit the enemy. For some extra ultimate tips, you don't have to worry about getting stuck in another ability's animation when you need to ult, meaning you can cancel your own attacks to guarantee your safety. Also, your ultimate will fully eat certain AoE attacks that normally would go through you, like Zeph's ultimate. So if many of your teammates are likely to get chunked by something like that, then you can use your ult to protect yourself and them. Now that we have the specifics covered, let's talk about how to apply this into a playstyle for Brall. Brawl's job is to get into the enemy team and cause as much havoc as possible for as long as possible. Yet this isn't as simple as just tossing yourself into the enemy team and slamming down your abilities. While Brall can do a surprisingly high amount playing this way, it isn't nearly as effective as it could be. Instead, playing Brall best is all about maximizing the time he can spend going wild in the enemy team. This brings up the question of how one actually goes about maximizing this time. There are 2 main concepts for this. First, minimizing how much enemy damage and abilities Brall actually takes, and then second, playing around the tempo of the fight. So to cover this, let's start with the first of these concepts, minimizing how much enemy damage and abilities Brall actually takes, before we then talk about the second one, fight tempo. Similarly, this concept of minimizing enemy damage and abilities taken can also be broken down into 2 concepts. The first of these is playing around vision, and the second is positioning. So I'll discuss them in this order, before going back to the overarching point about maximizing time spent fighting the enemy, and then talk about its second point, fight tempo. The first point to this concept of minimizing enemy value taken is playing around enemy vision, as the enemy having vision on you can be directly translated in some percentage chance to take damage or CC abilities. Specifically, playing for this means playing to hide your location before engaging on the enemy when they don't see you. While Brall can still force fights while enemies can see him, the longer enemies can see him before he engages, the longer they have to plan a defense, meaning they'll be more ready with damage and crowd control abilities. And while this might not result in him actually getting one shot or taking a stun, he'll be taking even more enemy damage regardless and be more at risk of being hit by their abilities. This just means he'll have less time to spend trashing the enemy afterward, which just isn't good. So instead, engaging rapidly from the shadows will limit this preparation time enemies would have, and reliably increase the value Brall can get post-dive. Continuing with this point, this leads us to the question of how does one actually stay hidden before engagements? The answer to this is that you need to flank. In standard gameplay, enemies will spend most of their time looking down the main sightline at your team. So by coming from a side angle or even behind the enemy, you're simply dramatically reducing the chance they'll accidentally spot you out, which is already achieving much of the goal. But in addition to this, you'll simply also be reducing the chance you get caught by accidental damage or crowd control when going in, while also then requiring your enemies to re-aim to you once you've jumped onto them, therefore making them have to do an extra skill check. Do all this and you'll be completely removing the wasted time you would have spent being attacked while getting in, and spend it instead on top of the enemies. Having answered the first part with this, we're now on to the second part of minimizing the damage and abilities Brall takes. This is all about how you position in the fight. Similar to how enemies will accidentally see you while engaging if you come from the front of them, you'll also take extra damage and crowd control after you dive if you position in between yourself and your allies, as you'll sometimes tank extra shots that weren't even meant for you, which oftentimes wouldn't even have hit your ally also. So instead, you'll want to position behind or on the sides of the enemy. This forces them to choose between attacking you and attacking your allies, which is especially useful with how a large portion of damage sources and abilities in Supervive will hit multiple targets at once. Similarly, you don't want to get stuck in the middle of the enemy team either, as when they then kite backward, you'll usually end up essentially just in front of your allies again, and stuck taking the accidental damage and abilities because of it. So in order to position well, you'll also need to think about where your first dive will place you. While it is good to reposition mid-fight to the sides or behind the enemy, it's even better if you can be there at the start of the fight. So while you're looking to jump in, plan to dash in a way you'll land to the side or behind the enemy. And if you can, look to go when there is also cover to use. So plan out your dash location before you engage, so you won't just put yourself in front of the enemy's main sightline firing range. This way you'll get much more time in the fight. So with the first part of maximizing the time Brall can fight his enemies covered, let's move back up and talk about the second part, which is playing around fight tempo. While this may seem like a complicated concept, it's really not. In Supervive, fight tempo just generally refers to the flow of who is currently winning a fight, which is based on things like amount of players alive on each team, HP levels, and the amount of resources that have been used. But what does this mean for Brall's gameplay? Since Brall is a full commitment type character, he's much more vulnerable to changes in fight tempo. Compare this to a character like Shrike, who can continue shooting at enemies from range even when her team has started losing. Sure, more enemies will begin to pressure her because of this, but it's still sort of indirect, and she doesn't have to risk much shooting at the enemies while slowly kiting them away. Brall does though. So when Brall's team begins losing a fight, more and more enemies will immediately be able to focus on him. Of course, he is a powerful character, but will still rapidly begin to flounder if he spends more than a few seconds when multiple enemies are free to stare at him. So Brall really needs to try and read how the fight is going, even before it happens, so he can avoid this. It'll mostly be easy to tell based on enemy and own team health bars, and how many of each are alive. But it's also important to pay attention to what kind of cooldowns have been used. Did your own team exhaust a few ultimates and some ranged stuns, while the enemy team hasn't used many? Sure, you may look like you're winning in a situation like this based on HP levels alone, but the flow may likely change. Similarly, Brall should think about the kind of value he got from his own engagement. Landed a good stun or anti, it probably means it will snowball into the enemy needing to use even more resources, and your own team getting extra value from theirs. Or if you didn't, it could be the opposite. Regardless, it's important to be aware of what's going on around you when fighting and think about the tempo. Yet the second half of this is actually then reacting to the tempo, which essentially comes down to pressing advantages and kiting disadvantages. Though Brall is a commitment-based character, this doesn't mean he has to commit to either fully killing the enemy or fully dying himself each dive. Rather, he can and should disengage if fights aren't secured, heal up, and then go back in for another opportunity. It's important to understand that the tempo of fights will sway during their course, but just because the tempo has swayed doesn't mean it's completely lost. Instead, most fights can be recovered, but the bleeding must be stopped before it becomes unrecoverable. This bleeding often comes in the forms of players not recognizing their team's weakness and continuing to play with their usual level of aggression when their team can't support them. Yet this is where Brall can thrive, as he has defensive tools and high mobility with which to disengage and stabilize with, and also that he can use to push advantages. Now, how does this play out in actual application terms? When playing Brall, you first need to have a mindset to save some of your dashes to escape or chase with, and to definitely not waste them all in the fight, which shouldn't be super hard considering how much mobility Brall has, but it's still possible. And also, you definitely need to not waste your ultimate. Brall's ultimate will be the power spike that allows him to mold the fight as he wants it to go if used well. It can allow him to secure a mostly win fight, give a powerful swing to an even fight, or save him from the ire of a full enemy team in a losing fight. So with a mindset to save these dashes and ult, you should focus on the flow of the fight, in terms of HP and resource exchanges. However, it's extremely important to understand that you often won't get an immediately determined fight after the first exchange. Yet regardless of this lack of immediate determination, Brall's value is still very spiky, having high highs and low lows. So in most situations where fights aren't immediately determined, you'll get heavily punished for continuing to push them on Brall. Instead, you should momentarily hide behind a corner and slow down when Brall's value is low, such as after he's attempted his stun abilities, is recovering his dashes, or has used his ultimate. Make sure to use this time as an opportunity to heal up also if possible. Then when Brall has at least his dashes and his HP recovered, you can re-engage for another high spike of power. This is how playing for fight tempo maximizes the time he can spend fighting the enemy. Though playing for these microkites in neutral fight tempos may reduce the time he is fighting in any given exchange, staying alive to go back in for another or multiple engagements will dramatically increase Brall's total uptime. So essentially, Brall's fight should look like a sort of repeated cycle of this that is biased towards the tempo of the fight as it changes, where he goes in from a hidden location, slaps his damage and stuns onto enemies, and then evaluates his aggression level after based on the tempo. Keep playing to the strategy of engaging and then doing microkites behind corners when you're low in resources, and eventually the tempo will either be swinging so hard against Brall's enemy that he can keep pushing after an engagement and force the fight into their deaths, or so hard against him that he must escape, which wouldn't have been his fault. Either way, by reading the fight tempo well, Brall can carry for his team and set them up for a fight win or a possible team resurrection to have a second chance if lost.